Hello, and we're going to continue our series. This one is called A Changing World, When Equilibrium in Economics Changes. So last couple times we talked about equilibrium and sort of how that runs through economics. This time we're going to look at what happens when the system changes and what we do about it. Okay, so equilibrium is always where we start. And so what we're going to be looking at today, we're going to focus just on demand and supply and look at how things change in economics from an equilibrium perspective. So using the framework of sort of the equilibrium analysis that we've been talking about, we're going to apply it to a linear demand and supply framework. So as we summarized last time, it is price that functions to bring supply and demand into equilibrium in a market and determines what the allocation of resources are given a certain set of production and consumer tastes and preferences. So we always start out, this is our supply equation up here, which I've denoted with an S. Down here is our demand equation, which I've denoted with a D. Where supply and demand are equal to each other, or where they intersect, is where we have equilibrium. And so at that equilibrium point, we have an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. The supply function can be rewritten in our linear form, and this is just y is equal to mx plus b, just rewritten with the variables that we happen to use. So in this case, the quantity supplied is here, and then this is our quantity demanded is down here. And so these are just sort of what we look at in terms of traditional demand and supply functions. On the supply function, the slope is positive, and down here the slope is negative. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that both equations are in slope-intercept form, which is y is equal to mx plus b. We want to set both equations equal to each other. We want to then solve for the price of x and plug either p of x into either the value that you solve for in the price of x either into the supply or the demand curve and solve for x. And then what that's going to do is going to yield the quantity demanded and quantity supplied that brings the market into equilibrium for you. So graphically, this is where the two curves intersect. So in this case, so we want to set demand equal to supply. So you have negative 1/2 p of x plus 10 is equal to positive 1/2 p of x plus 0. And then when we solve that algebraically, we end up with p star of x is equal to 10. We then plug that back into one of our equations to yield that the quantity demanded in the marketplace is equal to 5. So to show that really quick, so if we want to solve this, I'm going to subtract 10 from both sides, and I get negative 1/2 px is equal to 1/2 px minus 10. And then I would subtract 1/2 px from both sides, 1/2 px from both sides, and so then I have negative 1 px is equal to negative 10. And then, so obviously if we just divide by negative 1, divide by negative 1, we have p of x is equal to 10. So we know that the optimal price in this marketplace right here is equal to $10. We could then take this $10, this value of 10, let p of x equal 10, plug it into either our demand or our supply curve. So we'll go ahead and put it into our demand curve, so negative 1/2 times 10 plus 10, and that's going to equal our quantity demanded in the marketplace. And so that's going to be negative 5 plus 10, and that's just going to equal 5. And that's the answer we got down here. And if we plugged it into this equation here, we'd get the same answer, so that we know the optimal price and quantity. So we know that our P star is equal to 10, and our Q of X star is equal to 5 units. And so that's just a simple algebraic way that we can look at how to think about equilibrium. And so in this case, we just took a very simple linear model of demand and supply. And so the problem solving steps hopefully are relatively straightforward. So as long as we can put, and just for a simple demand and supply, make sure that they're in the form of y is equal to mx plus b. You set demand equal to supply. You just set, which is literally setting the two equations that you have equal to each other, solving for whatever variable's left over, and then taking that variable and plugging it back into one of your other equations to solve for the other variable. And so that's really, we make it much more complicated sometimes in economics. We can use calculus and do lots of things to make it look different. But these steps right here are relatively general. So you take the two equations, set them equal to each other, solve for your first variable, take that variable, plug it back into one of your equations to solve for the other variable. And that's what we spend a lot of times in economics doing. Okay, so let's kind of take a look at what happens when something changes in the marketplace. So the first change that we want to look at is actually what happens when price changes. So we have two sets of things in a simple demand and supply model that can change. And so the first one that I want to differentiate and highlight to you is what happens when price changes. So if price changes, so when we're looking at either demand or supply, and you're asked a question about, well, what happens if there is a delta P, a change in price? So if we're looking at demand and there's a change in price, all we're doing, like let's say we move up to this price right here at P1. And if we move up to P1 and we're looking at the demand side of the equation, what we see is that if price increases, we're going to move up and to the left along the demand curve. And so that's going to be a change in price, and that's a movement along the curve. So that's going to be a change in quantity demanded. And so my note here is you need to pay careful attention to what changed and then trace that change through each side of the market sequentially. And that's the key problem solving step, whether you're looking at multiple choice or trying to answer an essay question or just trying to solve something on your own. The analytical framework is such that what you need to do is think about what is the initiating change and then how that traces through all the different components of the market. So if a price is the only thing that's changing, prices are dependent, is our dependent variable up here. And when this variable changes, the only thing that's going to change is a movement along. Now if the things that underlie demand change, then you're going to be shifting the whole curve. So for example, the market that I'm going to look at this place is a little bit silly, but we're going to look at Ronco spray-on hair. Now this is an as seen on TV product, and so what we're looking at here, the quantity of X, our X market down here, is the bottles of spray-on hair. Now the reason I chose Ronco spray-on hair is that the Ronco spray-on hair is the #1 of all time favorite as seen on TV commercial, and so I thought that that would make a rather funny market. Suppose the price of spray-on hair falls because they have to use a non-lead colorant, which is more expensive than the lead-based version. So a can goes from $5 a bottle plus shipping and handling to $7 a bottle. And so the price actually rises here. I'm sorry. I was thinking something else. Suppose that the price of spray-on hair increases because they have to use a non-lead colorant, which is more expensive than the lead-based version. So a can goes from selling for $5 a bottle plus shipping and handling to $7 a bottle plus shipping and handling. So we have an increase in price as a result of something that changed in the supply world. So if I'm asking you a question about what happens to demand, this is going to be a change in quantity demanded, but it was due to a change in something in the world of supply. So in this case, we're going to go from, let's say this was the $5 and this is the $7 here. So we know that we have a new higher price. And so we have this new higher price in the marketplace of $7. So we're going to move up along this demand curve, this direction. And I'm going to try to make that a little bit bigger for you. So we're going to go up along the demand curve this direction. But in order to bring the market back into equilibrium, something had to happen in the supply world to make that happen. So we have a new supply curve that comes in up here like that. And so that's our new supply curve. And so supply would shift up and to the left because there's a new higher price in the marketplace, and as a result there's less quantity demanded in the marketplace. So the steps to solving this type of problem, so this is a price change for demand, and so the price is going to rise. We're going to move from P0 up to P1 along the demand curve, and then since there was an input cost rise, so what happened was that the supply curve changed because there was a cost increase in the price of inputs, and so the supply curve shifts back into the left, which is what happens when we have an increase in price, and they move along the existing demand curve to a new equilibrium price and a new equilibrium quantity demanded and supplied. And so what we see is that we have a leftward shift of supply and an upward movement along the demand curve. So when the price rises, the quantity in the marketplace that's demanded and sold falls. And so that's one of our primary things that we can look at. All right, so as we sort of move along with these types of examples, we want to look at what happens when a determinant of demand changes. So if something changes that affects how much at each price people demand, the entire curve is going to shift. So for example, the income, the price of related good, or tastes and preferences, if any of those things change, we're going to be shifting the curve entirely, and that's the difference. So when we have a change in quantity demanded, what we're looking at is a movement along the curve. If we have a change in the determinants of demand, then we have a shift of the entire curve, and that goes back to the utility preferences and some of those things that allow us to either move to different utility curves or shift along the same one. And so just remember that that framework rests behind this. So again, we're looking at spray on hair, and so suppose this time what's happened is that there's an environmental watchdog group, and it discovers that Ronco spray on hair causes polar bears to die. And so as a result, that there's a massive change in taste and preferences, and no matter how much people are compelled by the fascinating and exciting spray on hair infomercials, they just can't get over the dead polar bears. And so the demand for spray on hair falls by half because of the dead polar bears. And so in this case, the initiating change in this marketplace is just an absolute shift of demand due to a change in taste and preferences. So in this case, demand falls by about half. And so we would have a, sorry, that's not a very straight line. It's kind of hard to draw that. So we would have a downward shift of the demand curve, and it would be a linear line if I could draw with my pen. And so we would shift down to a new demand. So this would be D1. This is D naught, and so what would happen is nothing happened to supply. So nothing happened to Ronco itself. There was no change in input prices, nothing like that. So this was just a change in demand. So we would start at our equilibrium price here, and we would move down along the supply curve to the new demand curve. And so what we would see is that there would be a decrease in the amount sold in the marketplace. We would move leftward along Q. And we would also move down to a new lower price. So what would happen if we had this change in demand due to a result in a change in taste and preferences? If it was a decrease in demand, the price in the marketplace would fall, and the quantity supplied in the marketplace would also fall. And so we traced that out. So this was a decrease in demand, and so that was the initiating event. So something happened in demand world, so what we do is we focus on what that change was. So we look at shifting that demand curve, and in this case it's a lower demand, so it moves to the left and it falls, and then we move along the existing supply curve because nothing happened to that one. And so this is a change in demand because tastes and preferences have changed, and that causes demand to fall. And when demand falls, we have a decrease in price and a decrease in the quantity supplied given no changes in supply. So when we think about the different things that can shift and change, in this case, so that was some of the first two things that we wanted to look at. And in this case, now let's look at what happens when we increase supply. And so when there's an increase in supply, so we can have the same type of thing. There's two types of things that we can do when we have an increase in supply. One can be an increase in the quantity supplied, and one can be an increase in supply. Again, so when we have an increase in quantity supplied, something has caused price to change. And so what this usually means is that something has happened in demand that's triggered a change in that requires just, so the demand curve is shifted and we moved along the supply curve. Now we can also have an increase in supply, and that this is caused by a change in the determinants of supply, such as input costs, technology, government policy, resource availability. So anything, so for an increase, this is an outward shift of the entire curve, and at each and every price we have more supplied. So let's say some examples of what that is. You can have a change in quantity supplied, an increase in quantity supplied, and this could be because you have, there's an advertising was effective causing an increase in demand. A study comes out that shows spray on hair gets the dates, and that folks who use spray on hair are much more successful in the dating scene. All of these things would be things that would shift your demand curve. And so if you're examining what happens to supply when demand changes, what we see is that we move along the existing supply curve to a new equilibrium price and quantity. And so we'd have Q1 and P1. And so those are some of the things that can happen. And so that's going to be an increase in the quantity supplied. Now something that's going to change quantity supplied, I'll do that one in red. So let's say price of the key color additive and spray on hair changed and decreased, or it was discovered that 50% changed. I'm going to have to pause it here and we'll continue in a minute.